Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Matthew Jane, and I'm Learning and Engagement Manager for the State Historical Society of Iowa. The Iowa History 101 webinars, presented on the second and fourth Thursdays of each month, explore Iowa's history from pre-statehood to current day. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at history.iowa.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you'd like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live, all presentations will be recorded. Now, a few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa History page of YouTube in just a few days. I've disabled the chat function. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A features of the webinar. My colleague Rachel Hansen is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not get to all the questions before we end today. Now I'm pleased to introduce our presenter for today, Beth Cody. Garden historian Beth Cody is the author of T.R. Otsuka, a Japanese landscape artist in the American Midwest, 2023, Quarters One Gardens, Rock Island Arsenal, 2021, and Iowa Gardens of the Past, Lost and Historic Gardens of Iowa, 1850 to 1980, in 2020. Beth's focus in Midwestern garden history. She is fascinated by vintage garden photos and postcards, and is also interested in economic history and entrepreneurialism and how they relate to gardening. She has a master's degree in international finance from Brandeis University and a Bachelor of Arts degree in economics and Asian languages and literature, Chinese, from the University of Iowa. She lived in Beijing, China for 2 semesters in 1985 and 1987. Beth owns a small business and lives near Iowa City, Iowa, in a farmhouse in Amish country, where she enjoys gardening and researching, writing, and consulting about gardens and history. And now I'm happy to turn over to Beth to begin the webinar.
Thank you, Matthew. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you for inviting me to be a presenter for your Iowa History 101 series. I'll be speaking today about what I believe was Iowa's first Japanese garden, which I believe was built around 1910 in Burlington. And as Matthew said, I am a garden historian. I'm an author. I've published several books. I'm not an expert of any kind in Japanese gardens, however. I'm just a general garden historian. I don't have a Japanese garden myself. There may be some people listening, and thank you for tuning in, anyone who is out there and listening. Some of you may be Japanese gardeners and have actually made Japanese gardeners, and I can only envy you because they are such beautiful things, the Japanese gardens. But I am just a general garden historian. My interest is mostly in just Iowa and Midwestern gardening. But my book that I published, the first one about garden history in 2020, did include 2 Japanese gardens in it that I was able to find before the mid-century period. One is documented to exist. We know it exists because it still exists, and although there wasn't a lot known about it, the other one was more uncertain. I wasn't certain if that one actually existed. And the first one I just referred to, the one at the Muscatine Art Center in Muscatine, this was built about 1930, and this is a picture taken in the 1930s of it, on the grounds of what is now the Muscatine Art Center, but was the residence of Laura Musser McComb, who was a wealthy resident of Muscatine. And after her death in 1964, her house was donated by her heirs to the city and is now being used as the art museum there. And this, by my count, was likely the second Japanese garden to be built in Iowa. And there's some pictures of it, older photos like this one that the museum possesses, but they do not have any records of the garden's construction, like who built it. It's a total unknown, or why it might have been built. I was able to include these photos because the Muscatine Art Center very kindly shared them with me, and I was able to include these in my book. And I wrote a little bit of what is known about it, but I was disappointed there wasn't more known about it. And it was kind of a mystery how this garden came, this very unusual garden came to be located in Iowa. And the other one, the one that I wasn't certain about, is the garden of Mr. and Mrs. E.P. Eastman in Burlington, which was built before 1910. And there's at least 2 postcards that I ran across when I was searching for Iowa gardens that included the word Japanese garden or Japanese flower garden in the title of them. But if you look at this postcard picture, you may notice that there doesn't seem to be anything even remotely Japanese looking in this picture. This is clearly just a Western style flower garden. And when I found these postcards, I was kind of puzzled by this. But then I thought, well, maybe it was just a misunderstanding of what a Japanese garden was back in 1910 in Iowa. Maybe people just didn't know. Maybe they thought if perhaps a few flowers of Japanese origin, such as Japanese irises or a Japanese maple, would make it a Japanese garden. So I just kind of wrote that off as just a misunderstanding. But then when I was searching Google Books for references to Iowa gardens in magazines from the early part of the 20th century, I came across something that was a lot harder to dismiss, which was an article describing in great detail the Eastman Japanese garden. And this was published in a national magazine, The House Beautiful, in March 1913. And this article, which I've shown here on the right, A Small Japanese Garden, it is a very detailed description of the Japanese garden of Mr. E.P. Eastman of Burlington, Iowa. And it described a miniature torrent flows down the hillside over stones and empties into a miniature lake. A carved stone lantern resting on a ledge of rock, a path of smooth stones, a tea room with its thatched umbrella-shaped roof. These descriptive words and phrases really made it seem like there was actually a Japanese garden located on that property. However, no photos of any Japanese-looking garden area have ever been found of this, and many people, the Eastmans were important people in Burlington, and for at least 50 years, the local historical society and many local interested historians have been collecting photos of their property, and none have ever included a Japanese garden. And what was even more puzzling was that there was no mention of a Japanese garden in local newspapers ever being built there, which seemed very odd to me. So I wondered, did it even exist? However, this was such an impressive garden, even without the Japanese garden area, that I included it in my book. And I included a few phrases from the description, and I just noted that no photos have ever been found about it, and it's not certain if it existed or not. So again, it was another mystery. But then the year after I published my Iowa Gardens history book, in 2021, I was contacted by the director of the Muscatine Arts Center with some really exciting news that they were planning to renovate their Japanese garden there. And so they asked me if I would do some research about their garden. And so they obtained a grant from the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs to investigate the context in which the Muscatine Garden was built, to look into other pre-World War II Japanese gardens that had been built in the Midwest, and to try to answer the question, like, why would Mrs. McComb, the lady who lived here, have had a Japanese garden built for her? This is a very unusual thing. Again, I didn't run across any besides this one and the other one in my research. And then I also would possibly be able to investigate who might have built it, look into this. It seemed impossible after so long that we could discover this, but I thought I would give it a try. And so in 2021, I researched and wrote 8 papers related to pre-World War II U.S. Japanese style garden topics. And the most important part of that was that I looked for as many other residential and public Japanese gardens built in the Midwest before World War II that I could find. And when I was doing this research, I came across numerous ads and newspaper mentions of a Japanese garden builder who was working in Chicago during the 1910s and 1920s. His name, he worked under, was T.R. Otsuka. His name was Taro Otsuka. He may have come from Japan, but he worked under the professional name of T.R. Otsuka, and he advertised in many different magazines and newspapers during that period. I thought it was possible that maybe he did was the one who had built the Muscatine Garden. So I thought I would find as many pictures as I could find of the gardens he built that were credited to him and known to have been built by him, and then compare the features in those photos to the features in the Muscatine Garden to see if he could have built their garden. And after doing this, that's exactly what I believe very strongly, with almost 100% certainty, that he did in fact build this garden. If you look at the lanterns in here, you look at this lantern, and this is the Muscatine Garden, and then you compare it to these lanterns in other gardens that he was credited with having made. You can see that they're very similar, almost identical. These were concrete lanterns, and they were made of poured concrete that was poured into molds, and so they had different parts of them that would then all be assembled after they were hardened. And it looks like these were poured from the same mold. So to me, this is the most obvious similarity, and almost a smoking gun about that, whether these gardens were made by the same person. But there were many other features that were similar too. Like, for instance, the bridge in the Muscatine Garden is very similar to several others in other gardens made by Otsuka. And the stepping stones, you look here, stepping stones, he used those in many of his gardens, plus the planting, the irises, evergreens, and sometimes along on stream beds, he would plant sumac shrubs, which have these twisty trunks here, and he put those in his other gardens of his, as well as these clumps of irises and evergreen shrubs, irises here and evergreen shrubs. So there were a number of similarities. So I have concluded with almost as close to 100% certainty as possible that yes, he very likely did build that garden. And I thought, since no one had ever written anything about his work and about him, except for just a sentence here and there, I thought, since I had found all these gardens, that I should write a paper about him. And then after working on it, it turned into a 400-page book with hundreds of black and white photos of gardens that I believe he had some part of. And also, I published that in 2023. And also that year, I published a peer-reviewed article in the Journal of the North American Japanese Garden Association. And I concluded that he likely built probably 50 to 100 different Japanese gardens and various styles of rock gardens throughout the Midwest during roughly the period of 1905 to 1935. Now, after I did all of this work, I took another look at this mysterious possible Eastman Japanese garden, and I was able to come up with a thesis for that. I now believe that the Eastman Japanese garden likely did exist, just as it was described in that House Beautiful article, but only for a short time around 1910, that it was very likely built by T.R. Otsuka, and it was almost certainly the first Japanese-style garden in Iowa. Also, I'm able to speculate about why it might have been built and why it was only existed for probably such a short time, and also to show why it was so unusual for that time. Did it exist? Well, that all pretty much hangs on this article in the House Beautiful. Could the author, Helen M. Stevens, have, I don't know, imagined this whole thing and made it up so she could have an article in this magazine and get paid for that? Well, possibly. So I thought I would look her up and see if I could find out more about her. And Helen M. Stevens was born in Burlington in 1889. Excuse me. She graduated from the University of Iowa in 1910 with Phi Beta Kappa honors, so she was a good student. In February 1913, only a month before this House Beautiful article was published, she wrote a letter to the Chicago Tribune, which published it, and the address for her on that letter was on Jefferson Street in Burlington, which was only 2 blocks from the Eastman house. So she definitely could have seen this garden if she lived there. And then in 1915, Helen Stevens she got married and moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan, and she got a graduate degree in something. And then she worked on University of Michigan's Middle English Dictionary project for 32 years until she retired, which tells me that she was most likely a reliable researcher. She was employed in the same project for 32 years. So yes, I believe that it's very likely that she did actually describe this garden accurately and that it did exist. As to who built it, well, one clue is that in the very same issue of the House Beautiful, Otsuka, T.R. Otsuka, actually advertised in this issue. He had a small ad in the back, and in every other issue of this whole year, which could be a coincidence, but it's just one of many factors. Also, I was not able to compare garden features by looking at them in pictures, because there are no photos of the Eastman Japanese garden, but there's the written descriptions of them, and I can compare those to the features that he usually included in his gardens. Like, for instance, rock-edged ponds and waterfalls over rocks going into those ponds. He used those in every single one of his gardens, unless there was a natural pond that already existed there. He would build those. And the Eastman garden description, the tiny lake is edged with rocks, and miniature torrent flows down the hillside over stones cleverly supplied by waterworks. Stepping stones, he used those in 2/3 of his gardens, and the Eastman garden description says a path of smooth stones leads around the lake and through the garden. A thatched umbrella shelter, he used those in about 1/3 of his gardens, and this description had a tea room and its thatched umbrella-shaped roof included. And then irises and evergreens. Again, he used those in every single one of his gardens, and the Eastman garden description described overhanging iris, as well as a pine tree overhangs the water. And then if you look at these photographs of other gardens of his, these are all gardens that had waterfalls, close-ups of the waterfalls, into rock-edged ponds with stepping stones and lanterns and evergreens and irises. I mean, they were all in all of his gardens. They were all built about the same time as the Eastman garden. And so did T.R. Otsuka build this Eastman Japanese garden? I mean, of course, assuming that it did exist, which does seem kind of likely. Well, the garden features were similar. Chicago was only about 200 miles from Burlington, and he was by far the most widely advertised Japanese garden builder in the U.S., and perhaps the only one working in the Midwest at the time. So very likely, yes, he did build that garden. Then we get to the question of, well, why would Mrs. Eastman want a Japanese garden? This was tremendously rare and unusual that such a garden would be built in Iowa so early. How could this have happened? What might have inspired her to have a Japanese garden built for her? Well, clearly she must have seen one or more of them in person somewhere. Now, a lot of wealthy people were starting to travel to Asia themselves and see them in person in Japan during this time, but there is no record of the Eastmans traveling to Asia, only to Europe. It's possible she could have seen another private Japanese garden at a residence, maybe in Minneapolis or Chicago. There were a few that were starting to be built there, and she did travel to those places, and according to newspaper articles. Or the third way would be to have seen one of the Japanese gardens that was built at the World's Fairs. Now, that was the main way that most Americans first saw Japanese gardens in person, because most people did not travel to Japan in the early 20th century or the 19th century. And these were very unusual, and people noted them because they had never seen something like this before. The first Japanese garden built in the U.S. that anybody knows about was the one that was built at the 1876 World's Fair in Philadelphia, which was the first World's Fair held here in the U.S. And they had one or two small garden areas. They didn't have ponds or anything. They were just small areas with some lanterns in them. And they had the same sort of type of garden was in the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. There was a small tea house garden, and there's one pictured there. The first large Japanese garden built at a fair was the one built for the 1894 Midwinter Exposition in California, in San Francisco. It wasn't a World's Fair, but it was a smaller exposition. And that garden has actually survived and is now the Golden Gate Park Japanese Tea Garden. But that was the first large one that people saw and really captured people's imagination. But the largest one, and the one that most Midwesterners saw for the first time, was the one created in 1904 at the World's Fair in St. Louis. In fact, there were two large Japanese gardens built there. One was the official one, and there was also a concession theme park that had a Japanese theme and a large Japanese garden there. Now, going back and finding a little bit more about Mr. and Mrs. E.P. Eastman, who they were. Well, Edward Percy Eastman, he moved to Burlington from Ohio and became a partner in a furniture and mattress manufacturing company that I believe still exists. And he made investments in banking and real estate. He reorganized Burlington's water system, and he also led the financing and construction of the Hotel Burlington, which was a major project there after the turn of the century. He was, without doubt, a civic leader. And Millie Smith was the daughter of a local cigar factory owner, and her father built the house where they lived, where the Eastmans later lived, at 719 Columbia Street, which still exists. In 1897, she married E.P. Eastman, and she was a garden enthusiast. Later in the 1920s, she was often the guest of the Tri-Cities Garden Club. And after Mr. Eastman's death in 1925, she was a major benefactor to the Burlington community, and she gave to numerous charitable efforts. And their house at 719 Columbia Street, here's a photo of it. It stands on 3/4 of an acre, so it's a large piece of property. But the main notable feature of that property was that it sloped 60 feet from the front, which we see here, down to the back behind the house, with tremendously steep slope. And in 1906, the Eastmans had a retaining wall built over here on the left to level up this area so it wouldn't continue to slope down, and so they could use it to make a garden. And they had 3 terraces constructed here that had paths along them here. This is to level it out. And then the following year, in 1907, they laid out some formal gardens on what's later referred to as a sunken garden, because you could look down on it from above and see the shapes and make out the geometric shapes. And they planted the terraces. And according to a 1908 article, Mrs. Eastman designed this general garden layout herself, although she would have had professional landscapers come in and do the actual work for her. And then the question arises, well, what inspired Mrs. Eastman to build such, these are magnificent gardens? And here's that 1908 article where it talks about a beautiful garden and how this ugly hillside and waste place had been transformed into a place of beauty, and described it. And but this is one of the most impressive gardens I found when I was looking for Iowa gardens, and I wondered, how could this have come to be? Why would she have built such a garden and not just the the usual nicely landscaped plot? Well, they built that. They started building it in early 1906, and then there's a major event that happened in 1904 that they almost certainly attended. If you see here is a newspaper article from September 30th of 1904 saying that Mr. and Mrs. E.P. Eastman returned from St. Louis this morning. And so they almost certainly attended the World's Fair in St. Louis, which had humongous grounds. There was 1,200 acres of buildings and landscaping. And the gardens were really something. 2 million flowers and trees were used to landscape the acres of gardens. There were literally acres of formal gardens and Victorian flower beds and all sorts of styles of gardens. There was a 10-acre rose garden that had 75,000 shrubs in it, and massive water cascades that were totally impressive. And one of the icons of the landscaping for this fair was the world's largest floral clock that actually kept time. There was a mechanism that made this work. It was 100 feet in diameter, and the clock was, these are, thousands and thousands of tiny plants that made up the face of the clock. So this was really impressive. But one of the most popular of the garden areas was called the Sunken Garden. This was a very popular resting spot because it was 750 feet long, and it was sunk down maybe a dozen feet below the level of the surrounding grounds. But it was rimmed with benches. There were benches that went all the way around the sides of this. And so that's where tired fairgoers would come to rest their feet, and they could enjoy these beautiful gardens there. And if you look closely at some of the other photos of the sunken garden at the 1904 World's Fair, you'll notice there's a lot of similarities with the Eastman lower level sunken garden. The whole concept of a sunken garden is that you look down from above to be able to see the geometric layout and enjoy the shapes more than if you were just standing there. And then there were the Victorian mounded annual flower beds. This was a Victorian style of gardening. And there were the white gravel paths that were rolled so they would be very smooth. And then if you look here, this is the most obvious similarity. This shape, this is the entrance to the 1904 World's Fair Sunken Garden. The edges of the lawn, the sod against where the path is, was clipped very tightly, almost like with a knife. And this shape here is very similar to the shape of this lawn panel in the center of the garden. You get a better look at it. You can tell this is called a notched lozenge shape, which was a tremendously unusual shape. It took me a long time to figure out what this shape is even called because it's not common. But it seems quite possible that that she was inspired to use that shape because of this shape here. And it wasn't just these other gardens. There were also a lot of foreign gardens, which for the first time people had, many people had never seen an English garden or a French garden, but they were able to see them for the first time here. Here's the British pavilion with the British style gardens, and then the French had some really impressive gardens here. But the most notable and remarked upon of those foreign gardens was the Imperial Japanese Garden, which was the official Japanese garden at the 1904 World's Fair. This was the first Japanese garden seen by most Midwesterners. And because of that, it kick-started the first golden age of the popularity of Japanese gardens in the US, which was roughly between the 1890s, when there were a few of them being built. Then after this fair, they really began being built in earnest up through the 1930s. And the Imperial Japanese Garden was what we would now call a hill and pond style of garden, which meant there was a large pond at the center of it, and then there were many different areas you could view it from all the way around. Although this was different, of course, from real gardens in Japan, which real Japanese gardens can only be found in Japan. And because the builders of this had to adapt to all the local conditions and climate, but most importantly to American expectations of what Japanese gardens are, which had been influenced by the earlier World's Fair Japanese gardens that had been constructed. And the Japanese who built this garden wanted it to be appealing to Americans. So they built things that they knew Americans would like, even if they weren't completely faithful to what real Japanese gardens in Japan would have had. But regardless of how similar it was or not, it was a magical garden for most of the fair viewers who saw it. It was described admiringly in numerous newspaper articles. And my theory is that Mrs. Eastman was likely totally charmed by her magical experience at the fair and by seeing this garden. And before she left the fair, she probably bought a souvenir photo book of the fair, and this is one that is in the Library of Congress collection that shows. It has a picture of the sunken garden that includes that notched lozenge shape here, and also has one of the Japanese imperial garden and the British and French gardens. And maybe when she was planning her own garden, she decided she was looking at these photos, and that's how she came up with the designs for it. And in fact, it seems highly likely that she was inspired to build such beautiful gardens because she was so impressed by the ones that she saw at the fair, and they knew they had this spot they could make something like that. So as far as the Japanese part of the garden is, again, no photos have ever been found about it, but I've looked at the grounds. It's clear from the description it must have been on the lower level. And over on the eastern side, there just isn't enough room outside the paths, so it must have been over here on the west. In fact, it was probably in this photo, but you just can't see it because either the pergola is in the way or it's too far, it's dark under the trees. It must have been there. So in order to imagine what it was like, I drew a sketch of it, such as it is. I make no pretense to be any kind of artist, but I drew a pencil sketch, and then I used an online AI art program to add some watercolor effects to it, and then I added a few Photoshop features like the lantern and the tree and the tea house. Anyway, this sketch shows what it might have looked like. There was a waterfall that came down the hill over rocks and ended up in a small rock-edged pond. And there were stepping stones that led through the garden and across the pond. There was a tea house with a thatched umbrella-shaped roof and a carved stone lantern under a tall twisted pine. And then in the corner, the description said that there was a carved wooden gate that had carved scenes from Japan on it, which must have been in his corner. That's what I imagine, and this is the path in here in the formal garden. That's what I imagine the garden looks like. But what happened to this garden? The fact that it was never mentioned in any newspaper article. Well, there was Mrs. Eastman held a big garden party in her garden in June of 1913, and there were descriptions of the garden, and there was no mention of that. So I suspect it was probably already removed by that time. Well, that meant it didn't last for very long. She must have been unhappy with it for some reason, and I guess it's possible that there could have been some technical problem with it, like maybe the water works stopped functioning, maybe they got clogged. That does happen sometimes. Maybe the thatched roof of the tea house didn't survive the winters, because those aren't meant for Iowa winters. But she could have fixed those problems if she liked the garden. But I suspect she just maybe it didn't remind her sufficiently of the World's Fair Japanese garden. It was a miniature garden, not a larger one like the one at the World's Fair. And maybe it just didn't remind her enough of the magical experience she had there. Or it's even possible that the publication of the article in March 1913 embarrassed her somehow. But when I was researching Japanese gardens here, I noticed that the early ones were usually built by avant-garde artists or intellectuals or wealthy travelers who had been to Japan. But the Eastmans were none of those things. They were of the conventional Midwestern mercantile class. They weren't, intellectuals or avant-garde artists, and they had never traveled to Asia. I suspect that the garden was just too unconventional. It was likely a madcap decision of Mrs. Eastman to have this put in, and then she realized it was just too different from anybody else's garden, and she may have thought it just looked out of place in an Iowa garden. I suspect that's my theory of why it was removed so soon. So here's just a brief timeline of their garden. I think the Eastmans attended the 1904 World's Fair and were inspired by it, built a retaining wall in 1906. In 1907, they installed this sunken garden. I found an article that said in the second half of 1908 that they were traveling in Europe, and also the May 1908 article about their garden did not describe the Japanese garden, so I don't think it existed until probably 1910 or 1909, perhaps. That it was built, and that's when the postcard photos were taken of it too, that were labeled Japanese garden. The earliest postmark I have found for this postcard here was March 1911, which, because it showed flowers and foliage, must have been taken the previous year in the summer of 1910, or before that, maybe 1909. And again, the House Beautiful article was published in March 1913, but it must have been written the previous year for the author to describe flowers and foliage. And so it was, and then by the June garden party, it was gone in June of 1913. So the Eastern Japanese garden probably only existed for 3 or 4 years, which is it's sad that they never took any photos of it and that they didn't like it. Mrs. Eastman enjoyed her gardens for another 50 years after that, however. She loved gardening and her gardens. And after her death in 1959, the property was sold to a local funeral home. And then in 2002, it became private property again. And I visited last year, and this is what it looks like now. There have been several attempts to restore the gardens, or some version of them, since the 1980s, but none of them has ever worked out. It's just too difficult and expensive to do that. But I want to emphasize that Mrs. Easton's Japanese garden was highly unusual. In fact, it was so unusual she felt uneasy with it and didn't keep it for very long. It was just too unconventional in 1910. And it was 2 decades more, 1930, before the second Japanese garden was constructed in Iowa by my count, and that's the one in Muscatine. It wasn't until the 1960s that Japanese gardens became common in Iowa. And here's just a short history of Japanese gardens in Iowa based on my newspaper and magazine searches. Again, the Eastman Garden was the first, around 1910. I was very surprised not to find any Japanese gardens at all in the 1920s, not even in Des Moines or the Quad Cities, Davenport, which, I mean, this was a time when many of them were being built in the Midwestern states, and I was surprised not to find even one. And then again, it was not until 1930 that Mrs. McComb's garden was built in Muscatine. Then during the 1930s, there were two other smaller gardens that were built in Muscatine by other women who, you know, obviously I think they were all in the same garden club together. So they must have visited Mrs. McComb's garden, and then two other women built small Japanese gardens. And then there was another small Japanese-esque garden in Council Bluffs during the 1930s. And then I found another one in Davenport that was built just before 1940 by a businessman who had traveled to Japan. Wasn't able to find any pictures of that, but then during World War II, because we were at war with Japan, after Pearl Harbor, a number of Japanese gardens across the United States were either renamed as Chinese gardens, or some of them were even removed or destroyed after Pearl Harbor. So there weren't any being built during the 1940s. But during the 1950s, I did find at least two in Des Moines that were being built. And both of them were probably smallish gardens. One was Faye Huttenlocker. She was one of the editors of Better Homes and Gardens magazine, about flower arranging. And her friend, Tomoko Yamamoto, who was an Ikebana master, who had come to California, I think in the 1910s, and taught classes there. And Faye Huttenlocker had traveled to California to take classes with her during the 1920s. And then Mrs. Yamamoto was interned during World War II, but after she was released, Mrs. Huttenlocker invited her and her husband to come live with them in Des Moines. And I think her husband passed away fairly soon after they moved here, but Mrs. Yamamoto lived in Des Moines for the rest of her life and taught thousands of Iowans Ikebana Japanese flower arranging, and she was very instrumental in influencing Iowa taste toward the beauty of Japanese gardens. One of her students was Dwight Kirsch, who was the director of the Des Moines Art Center during the 1950s. And after he traveled to Japan to learn Japanese brushwork art, he built a small Japanese garden around his modernist home in Des Moines. And also in 1957, the Des Moines Home and Flower Show featured a Japanese garden in it as one of their feature gardens. And what was happening was that the U.S. government, because this was the Cold War era, was trying to prevent Japan from, perhaps becoming communist and allying with the Soviet Union. So they emphasized trying to have good relations between Japanese and America, and they initiated the Sister Cities program, which in 1959, Des Moines and the city of Kofu in Yamanashi Prefecture in Japan became sister cities and still are. And during the 1960s, there were many how-to books and magazine articles that were published about Japanese gardens. So it became possible for middle-class gardeners to build their own, and they didn't have to rely on hiring an expensive Japanese garden maker like T.R. Otsuka. They could make their own. And in 1962, the Des Moines Home and Flower Show, again, they had not just one, but three different display gardens of different styles of Japanese gardens in it. So that was really the focus of the show, and showing how Japanese gardens could go very well with the new modern style of architecture for the houses that were being built. And in 1963, Iowa got the first Japanese garden that was a permanent one, a public one, in Washington Park in Waterloo. There was a postcard of it. And that was designed by Siberius Saito, who was an architect. He grew up in California and was interned during the Second World War. And after that, when he was released, he settled in Waterloo, and with a partner, he started an architecture firm, which I believe still exists there. And so he designed both this Waterloo, Washington Park Japanese garden and tea house here, as well as a small garden around the Japanese Friendship Bell house on the Des Moines Capitol grounds, which I'll talk about more in the next story. And also, I was able to find references in newspapers to at least 25 residential Japanese gardens that had been built in Iowa. Some of these were featured in articles that showed photos of them, but most of them were just mentions in real estate listings that I was able to find the addresses for them. So there were probably far more than 25, and those are the ones that were mentioned that I found. But back to this sister cities relationship that we have with the city of Koku. Many people who are Iowa history buffs probably are aware of this, but it started because in the 1950s there were, and a lot of it was due to Mrs. Hatamoto and Mrs. Yamamoto, who took trips together and tried to work toward Japanese American relations, and held things like a Japanese friendship dinner they held in 1950, and the Japanese slides shown at the Founders Garden Club in Des Moines. And then in 1959, a sister city relationship was formed with the city of Koku. And in the following year, one of the dramatic stories, there was a giant typhoon that hit Japan and really harmed Yamanashi province, which is where Koku is. And so Iowans donated several dozen hogs and some corn to help them rebuild after that. And in gratitude and in response, the state of Yamanashi gave Iowa this friendship bill, which is still housed on the grounds of the U.S. Capitol. And then we became a sister state in 1961. So the whole province is now the sister state of the entire state of Iowa, not just the city. And here's a picture of the Des Moines Men's Garden Club. In one of their gift exchanges, they received a bunch of fans and they're fooling around with those, which I thought was pretty fun. But continuing this short history of Japanese gardens in Iowa, in the 70s, there were even more of them built than on residences than I had discovered in the 1960s. And the 1970s and 80s were a time when many large public Japanese gardens were being built in the Midwest, like in Bloomington, Minnesota, St. Louis. The Missouri Botanical Garden, one theirs was in 1977. Maybe some of you have visited that. I know I try to visit that every year. It's so beautiful. The Anderson Japanese Garden in Rockford, Illinois in 1978. Denver and St. Paul, Minnesota, 1979. Chicago Botanic Garden in 1982, and the Minnesota Arboretum in 1985. And there were people in Des Moines who wanted to have a large Japanese garden built in the city of Des Moines. And in 1986, they had a design made by Koichi Kawana, who was one of the noted garden designers at that time, made for Union Park, which would have been a wonderful Japanese garden, but they were not able to get funding for it. And then, so they tried again 2 years later. Mr. Kawana eventually designed, 2 years later, another smaller design for around the Bell House to slightly enlarge that, but they couldn't raise money for that either. And I think the reason they had trouble finding the money at this point to fund it was because there were trade tensions that had developed between Japan and the United States in the late 1980s. And so corporations just didn't want to donate to that. But eventually, in the 90s, the Dubuque Arboretum was able to install a really beautiful Japanese garden in there, as part of their arboretum. And I highly advise you visit that if you can. And people were still making residential gardens. I was able to find at least a dozen during each of these decades. And some of these residential gardens built in the 1990s were really exceptionally beautiful gardens. The Jim Wiertz in Bettendorf, that was in a feature newspaper article, and his was really amazing. It was designed by Koichi Kurisu, who was a great Japanese garden master. The Magruders in Indianola, I believe, still have a lovely, lovely garden there. And there was a doctor in West Des Moines who had a very nice one as well. And and people still continued to build them into the 2000s, although it was much harder for me to find references to them in newspapers simply because most real estate listings are done online now, and it's much harder to search those than newspaper clippings. Eventually, Des Moines did get an Asian garden, the Robert D. Ray Asian Garden along the river, and John Deere Chinese Pavilion in the town. That is not a Japanese garden, it's an Asian garden. But hopefully at some point there will be a Japanese garden that will be built in Des Moines. But there is the Muscatine garden, I do have to tell you, was just renovated a couple of years ago, and they did a very nice job with it. I was worried because they tore the whole thing out, and I was worried it wouldn't be nice afterward. It wouldn't look like it had, but they did actually quite a decent job with it. I'm very impressed. The reason they had to renovate it was because the tree, this is one tree here. They just got so massive, and everything was just shaded and dark, and the garden features had just gotten worn out, and things just weren't, and there were accessibility issues, and it just wasn't as beautiful as it had been in those early 1930s pictures. So they basically took almost all of it out down to the ground and restored it. So I guess it's not technically the same garden, but it's very beautiful, and it's absolutely in the spirit of the original garden. It's beautiful rock work and fountains that go to the waterfalls that go down into other fountains on 2 different levels. And really, they've done quite a nice job of that. And they put several plaques there, and I was honored that they mentioned me as having contributed to this historic research that was done for both the garden renovation, as well as they published some booklets about it, how the garden came to be, and they acknowledged my contribution to that, and so that's very exciting for me, and I highly recommend you come take a look at this in Muscatine. The garden's open all the time, and I think as the shrubs and trees continue to mature, it's going to be very beautiful. It's young now, but I think it's a very positive for Muscatine. And so summing up, the history of Japanese gardens in Iowa, well, from 1910, when I believe the first one was built, until the present, what's interesting to me as a garden historian is why they were made. Why did Iowans decide to have these gardens, or build them themselves, or have them built for them? And it took longer for Iowans to accept that Japanese gardens were a beautiful thing that they could enjoy here in Iowa. Those became far earlier accepted in California and the West Coast, and in big cities on the East Coast. But the process of how they became acceptable and then popular here in Iowa is really interesting to me, and why people wanted to have them built. And my studies have led me to conclude that Iowans created Japanese gardens because it was out of the love for the artistic beauty that they represent. They really are beautiful spaces, and once Iowans were fully on board with that, they became just as enthusiastic as the people of California and New York in constructing them and showing their appreciation for another culture. And now I'm thankful to say that it is laudably common for Iowans to cherish and admire the peaceful beauty of Japanese gardens right here in Iowa. So if anyone is interested in finding out more about the books I've written, or just about the research I've done, it's all on my website, iowagardens.com. The 3 books I've written. One was my Iowa Gardens book. One is about a really amazing garden that was existed on Rock Island Arsenal near the commander's residence at the turn of the century or slightly after 1920. And then my TR wrote a book about his work. So thank you very much for allowing me to speak and be part of the Iowa History 101 program. And does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask me?
Yeah, thank you, Beth, so much. I spent 12 years living in Muscatine, and I'll vouch for the Japanese garden there in Muscatine. It was fun to see that renovation project happen. Very close to my house, so I walked through it many times.
Oh, great.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, great. That's wonderful. It's a beautiful place. It was a beautiful place, and I think it will become even more beautiful as it matures again.
Yeah, I'm excited to see it grow and fill out for sure. So for any of you following along at home, we do have time to answer a couple of questions, probably have time for 2. So if you do have questions, you can submit those through the Q&A feature that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We may not be able to get to all of your questions, but I will lift up a couple of them here. So Beth, the first question for you is about that Burlington postcard of the Eastman residence. How did you
Yes.
stumble across some of these original postcards?
Oh, well, the Burlington postcards, those were printed in great numbers. I think every time I look on eBay, there's at least 3 or 4 of them listed. And so I had automatic searches going for Iowa garden postcard that would email me every day, and I would look at whether they were public gardens or large private gardens like that, or sometimes they were just pictures of people's modest houses with a few plants in front of them, which I love those pictures too. So yes, I spent 5 years searching for Iowa gardens, and that one came up very early because, as I said, so many of those postcards were published. And of course, the Des Moines County Historical Society has a large collection of those as well, more than I only have 2 or 3, but there's been more published.
Yeah, and how neat that you found a written account of the garden. And it just makes me wonder, is the postcard out there with the Japanese garden? Is that something like you continue to wait and hope for, or keep your eye out for any other postcards that might stir up?
I have not yet actually visited the Des Moines County Historical Society, and I'm planning to do that later this year, maybe this spring, just to see if there might be any unidentified photos of Japanese gardens in their collection that they just haven't ever made that connection with. But yes, there's always a hope that that something will turn up. One of the major finds I made when I was searching was a picture of the first greenhouse that was constructed at what is now the Capitol, the residence, the first family residence in Des Moines. What is the name of I've totally slipped my mind. Well, anyway, the
Terrace Hill, maybe? Yeah.
Yes, Terrace Hill. Sorry, that just blanked out. Yes, the Terrace Hill. One of my daily emails that I would get showed me that, and as soon as I saw it, I realized it was a stereograph photo from probably 1871, and nobody ever knew what that greenhouse looked like. It was beautiful. And as soon as I realized what it was, they had done archaeological digging in that, so they knew what the shape of it was, but they never knew what it looked like. And then when I ran across that, I just couldn't believe what a treasure that was. And I did have to spend some money to get that, but I was certain that I was not going to let that get out of the state again. And I donated that to the Iowa City Historical Museum for that. But that was one of the amazing things I was able to find. So yes, I have hope that you never know what's going to turn up as far as photographs of these missing garden areas.
Yeah, historical treasures for sure. Well, we are about out of time, but before we go, I want to let you know we have a Burlington native on who said, no questions, but found the story of the Eastman Garden fascinating near where I grew up. So sad that it no longer exists. So exciting that we have a Burlington crowd here today.
Great, thank you. That's lovely. I'm so glad someone from that town who has an inside knowledge of that, and both of you actually who have visited, lived nearby both of those gardens, can find that meaningful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And so with that, we're going to bring this webinar to a close. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. And we'd like to extend one last thank you to our presenter, Beth. We hope everyone will sign up for the Iowa History 101 webinars that take place on the second and fourth Thursdays throughout the year. There are many great stories to tell in the upcoming months. For more information and to register for future webinars in this series or to watch recordings, you can check out our website at history.iowa.gov. Looking to learn more Iowa history? You can find and watch over 90 recorded webinars of past 101 programs on the Iowa Culture YouTube channel. We look forward to virtually seeing you for the next special Iowa History 101 webinar on April 10th. The topic will be A Prairie Faith, the Religious Life of Laura Ingalls Wilder. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.